Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. People have drifted in the time-honored way with all conferences. We have a new title for this conference called the Innovative Discoveries Series. I think it's just great. It really describes well what we're doing. I want to welcome Wilmington Hospital. They now have a conference room where they can see what we're doing here. Also, all online participants, please mute your mics unless you are asking a question. Because the way Blue Jeans works, otherwise you're just gonna show up, and then it'll actually interrupt the lecture. You can use the chat feature of Blue Jeans if you have technical questions. And, Sarah Faye will try and respond as best we can. All of our previous lectures are available on the web at the Delaware ACCEL website. And if you're not a member of Delaware ACCEL CTR, shame on you. Please sign up. We really want everybody aboard. It's really exciting today. This is the first time we're offering CME. You can receive your CME credit online. You can use the chat function with Sarah Faye. She'll get you started on how to do that. Please complete the program evaluation through the link. So it's really very exciting today to welcome David Tulsky, who very rapidly has become a very good friend of myself. This institution, maybe many people here in Delaware. He received his education at the University of Illinois, including a PhD in psychology. He then had faculty appointments at a number of schools, rising to be a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. He's done all kinds of things. His grant papers and book chapters and so forth are innumerable, so I'll not be able to go in. He's worked particularly in the past. He worked on IQ testing, but for a number of years now, he has worked in outcomes research with special interest in health status assessment. So this is an area of research that has a lot of interest here at CTOR and the Value Institute. So I think we've all been really looking forward to having him here and hearing this talk. David, thanks so much for spending your day.
Thanks, Bill, for that nice introduction. So let me start by talking about, if I can move that up here. Let me start by talking about what I'm going to cover today and give you an idea of where we're going. Connect this up. There we go. So what I want to do is really describe new measurements and really influencing medical care. Clinical trials definitely, but also I think the clinical care side of things too. I've done a lot of work in rehabilitation medicine, so you'll see a lot of spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury examples, but I think it really translates to lots of different populations. And what's happening now, there are some large initiatives and emerging measures that are coming out. So what I want to do is discuss something that seems pretty dry, and I'll try to just at least give you a touch. I think there are new psychometric approaches with computerized technology that really have potential to create a paradigm shift in the field. Oh, sorry about that. And then I'll tell you about how we developed some patient-reported outcomes for spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury, and then we'll talk about how to utilize them in clinical practice. Just so you can get a list, I want to thank the funders. We have a lot of different funders. We've been doing this for a while in multiple different areas and lots of different areas. And the first thing to tell you is I couldn't have done this work alone. This really was a collaboration of several different institutions, and I'm just indebted to all the people who are working with us. So what I want to start with is something called the Patient-Reported Outcome Measurement Information System. I don't know how many people are familiar with hearing about that, but this was a big initiative that NIH started in 2004. And since then, they've invested over $100 million new scale, really designed to be game-changing in outcomes measurement. NINDS, one institute within NIH, really came up with their own project trying to do something parallel to PROMIS, except geared towards people with neurological disabilities and disorders. In that spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury is where we've adapted things, really done things to fit those populations. And then there's also another one, the toolbox, which I won't get into today. I want to make sure people are aware. There's been about $30 million invested in a toolbox, which is more objective measures. So NIH is really measurements. And, you know, the objectives and goals of all of these are to develop large item banks to measure patient-reported outcomes, focusing on a wide range of domains, and you'll get a sense and see it in a little bit. But then use this psychometric computerized adaptive testing approach to make things shorter, but yet more precise, which seems like a paradox, but I'll show you how and why that is supposed to work. Then make it available for researchers and clinicians to use for free. So PROMIS started as part of this NIH roadmap for a common fund, and it was designed to re-engineer the clinical research enterprise, and it was to allow comparison across medical conditions. So NIH said, when we start investing in doing these outcome studies, let's get all of our grantees using the same measure. We can compare across our portfolio. Think of the leverage we'll have. For people doing population health studies, people in the Value Institute, this is a very promising thing if you could have one measure that you can compare across the population and have a ruler that really would fit everyone. And like I said, they've invested a lot of money. They've developed it in Spanish and in English and adult pediatrics. Just so you can see, this was the network that just finished, is really wrapped up funding, but you know, a little bit of carryover money's left. What they did was they funded 3 network centers that were the glue. David Sella and Richard Gershon at Northwestern University deserve a lot of credit for building the infrastructure, for how to measure it. Dave Sella for really developing the platform on it. And then there were several grantees that came in research projects. So our focus was looking at children and young adults with disabilities, population. And the goal overall with PROMIS was to get clear definitions of what we should measure, really review everything that's been out there and develop thousands of items in a pool, and then start sorting them into bins of what's getting. The other aspect was to get patients involved from the get-go. What's important to them to measure? What are symptoms going on? And really taking evidence verbatim and turning it into items, doing it through focus groups, and then getting other patient groups to start evaluating the items. Can you understand what we meant? Kind of do a cognitive debriefing and talking through. So it really is very patient-centric at the get-go, that cognitive interviewing. WHO came up with a platform of really health is that not just the absence of disease, but physical, mental, and social well-being. It's a multifaceted trait. So when people hear quality of life, a lot of people think it's just emotional well-being, but really it covers health status as well as social status too, from the original WHO standards and what PROMIS has tried to do. And you can see in the framework, they created 3 equal symmetries and looked under physical health at symptoms and function, affect, behavior, and cognition under mental health, and social health was the relationships and function. And each one of these could get broken down. So for every box there is an item scale that measures it. So there's a pain behavior, a pain interference, fatigue, physical functioning, sleep disturbance, sleep-related impairment, sexual functioning for adults. And that's version 1. That second round of funding with all those examiners, people started developing a lot more banks. Pediatric banks just kind of exploded, and large part Chris Forrest up at University of CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, part of UPenn system, really has done a lot in that area. Just so you can see the mental health bank, similar type thing with anxiety, depression, anger, illness, impact, and then cognitive concerns. And then social health, you can see again, lots of different areas, not only ability to participate, but how your relationships are working and a lot of different aspects of relationship. Each one of these banks could be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 items, but you're not giving all the items. You're only going to give a snippet in it, and you can get an area of those domains. And the key thing is that for each of these boxes, it's very unidimensional, measuring a single thing. Now here's the important point and the whole crux of the talk today is PROMIS and the other IRT-based scales that I'm talking about will require a paradigm shift in the way you think about testing. You're used to giving a bunch of items and adding up the score and coming up with the total score, and that's how people perform. And this is a different way of estimating where somebody is and how somebody's doing, and it's based on a concept called item banking. And that's where you take the large collection of items, all measuring the single unidimensional thing, and you try to rate how they are. You get the items from lots of different places. Existing questionnaires is a real good one, and you're developing new items, and you're developing the new items from asking content experts, you're asking patients. So you could be doing individual interviews, focus groups, but really getting in there, talking to the people who know best. Really having them test the items and develop well-developed items, and then also any secondary data analysis of existing data sets. Key is you get a lot of items in this pool, more than you could possibly give. In the research phase, you're giving everybody all the items within an area, and you're using item response theory as a psychometric testing under the hood. And that's what develops this from an item pool, a collection of items, to what we call a calibrated item bank. And here's what's unique about it. You could then give people short forms. You could also give people a computer-assisted device. Different people will take different items, and the scores will all mean the same thing. And that's what I'm going to walk you through right now. So let's take physical functioning. Karen Cook at Northwestern University deserves all the credit for this graphic. She is just wonderful at developing graphics, but this tells the story so much better than I could do it alone. So as you see, we're trying to develop a ruler. And here's what's unique about an IRT-based scale is you're trying to put people on that ruler and you're trying to rank the items on that ruler. So you're only going to give the items that are relevant to each person. And you can see through IRT calibrations, you're lining up the items, matching it, and the people are lined up on the ruler too. If you look at actual items potentially, you can see the person all the way on the left who's bedridden. Questions like, are you able to get in and out of bed? Are you able to stand without losing your balance for 1 minute? Those would be the appropriate ones. Items like, are you able to run 5 miles? Aren't so good for that person. And our existing scales right now just take snippets of items and everybody gets everything. And that's where this approach really has promised to change things. So once you have the ruler drawn, the people on the ruler and the items on the ruler, you have all these different choices on how to administer it. So in the center of this, you can see emotional distress, pain, physical functioning item bank. I think that's pretty clear. And then you have different short forms you could give, different customized short forms, as well as a computer adaptive test. And I'm going to break this chart up into pieces so you can see it. Let's start with the computer adaptive test technique. What you're going to do, and you can see there's all these different banks that I showed you before, the emotional distress, the pain, the depression, the anxiety. Each one of these is a bank of items, and underlying that bank of items could be 20, 30, 40. In physical function, I think there's 96 items in the bank. And you're going to use a computer to select the questions based on somebody's responses and only give a subset of items to each person. So let me show you this. The computer is selecting the items based on the person's response. And as it gives an item, it's iteratively estimating where somebody is on that ruler. You're not adding scores, you're estimating where they are on that ruler. When you stop giving items, you have a place on that ruler, and that's their score. And you're only giving the most informative items to the person. So if you start with depression, a whole wide range of items potentially, and the first item would be, say, an item 1 standard deviation above the mean. The way they respond on that question can help you pick what the next items are. You eliminate the items at the very top end of suicide, for instance, and you eliminate all the items at the very low end. You have a narrower range. And when they respond to that, 1 1/3 standard deviations above the mean, you then start narrowing the ruler more, so you're getting at the precision of exactly where they are. And that's the goal, where you can really have this wide band of items, but yet the precision built in as well. So I'm going to demonstrate on pain. This is our spinal cord injury pain bank. These are really PROMIS items under the hood. But what you can see here is a lot of items. That's all you need to see. More items than you would want to give to any one person. And here's how the score is set up. At the bottom, you can see the values that are circled would be the minimum number of items you want to administer, the maximum number of items you'd want to administer to anybody, and then the most important is the maximum standard error. This is where the program will cut off. So in this case, people will get at least 5 items, no matter what. But once their standard error of measurement reaches 0.3, it'll stop administering items, as long as they got 5. And if they don't get a score within that range, after 12 items, it'll just give up. So again, you can control how long it takes by that. Or, I'm sorry, not 12, 20 items in this case. It's above the default. Users have the power to select that. So if you're doing quick screening, you can say, let's get 4 items as quick screener and 6 items at the most, and we'll have a little noisier thing. Or you can have more precise. As a clinical trial, we want to pinpoint their scores. Let's give a minimum of 10 items to everybody. So those are all programmable by the user. First item given is how much pain did pain interfere with your day-to-day activities, and the person said somewhat. Notice it's all computerized. So where I'm going at the end of this talk is iPads in the waiting room with really good clinically useful data that could be used. So realize that too, because the score is coming instantly. So we gave 1 item, and the computer is estimating that the person's score will be a t-metric of 60.6. It's 1 standard deviation above the mean. Theta is where their ability is. So the t-score, it's just a scaling issue between the theta and the t-score. The standard error is 0.3, so it would have discontinued, but we said it had to get 5 items. Based on that response and a t-score of 60, it decided the next best item was how much did pain interfere with your enjoyment of social activities. And you can see it started iteratively changing the score. The best estimate now is that somebody is really 63.7, so 1 1/3 standard deviations above the mean. And it'll keep going, estimating the person's score with each item, getting more precise. Notice the standard error is going down as you give more items. 5 items were given. Standard error of 0.15, that's a very reliable measure. And in 5 items, even though there were about, I don't know, too many on the screen to look at, in 5 items, you got a pretty good estimate of where somebody's pain ability is. Probably a minute to give all those items to somebody. Now, the same token, you could have said, I don't have a computer, so I want to give a shortcut. So pre-programmed, we selected items that we thought were the best discriminating items in the bunch, and took that and came up with an 8-item short form, for instance. Or, in spinal cord injury works really well for this, because you could have a broad range of items covering all types of functioning and physical functioning. It would apply to people with paraplegia and tetraplegia, but then the people with tetraplegia would get items that are relevant with hand functioning, etc., where the people with complete tetraplegia would only get the ones that would be relevant for maybe I said it backwards, but I think you get the idea. You'd have different sets of items for the different levels of severity. If we were looking this graphically, the person who's bedridden really would have items at that low end in that blue bar. You can see those would be the items selected on a short form if we were developing a customized short form. For somebody who's higher functioning, the Bader is a good example of that, where you're testing people wanting to return to the military, people who've had amputations and wanting to get back there. You want to look at high performance type applications. You'd want to see if they can do a lot of activity. And then you might have a study where you just involve everybody across the whole spectrum, and you want to snip it across the whole thing. Each of these would be a valid short form depending on what you're testing and trying to use. Key here is that because what you're doing is taking a sample of items, not adding scores, you're estimating where they are on that ruler. You can have different items going to different people. Different studies can use different items. All of this is on the same metric, the same meaning. It could cut across all populations. So the way the PROMIS works is the mean is 50, standard deviation 10, and this is anchored to the U.S. general population. So let me just show you, this is Jim Fries, is a rheumatologist who was one of the PROMIS investigators, and he did this wonderful graph in really showing the precision of PROMIS. Jim had developed a study called the Health Assessment Questionnaire, which is very widely used in rheumatoid arthritis patients. And he started by taking SF36, a commonly used measure, short form 36, from the RAND studies that were going on. And he took a 10-item version. And what he showed was that for people functioning 1 to 2 standard deviations below the mean, you have pretty adequate reliability. It might not be that bad a measure. But as you get to the tails of the distribution, the reliability is insufficient. This is showing it a standard error of 0.3. That could be a reliability of about, I want to say 0.88 or so, but there's a direct correlation between reliability. So as you go under that 0.3 mark, you're getting a pretty reliable measure. You're not having that reliability when you're out at the tails. The Health Assessment Questionnaire with 20 items really extends the range downward. It's good for people with impairments, and that's how he had designed it. Well, if you look at the full bank of 126 items, Jim Fries also deserves credit for really developing the PROMIS physical functioning bank. You have precision really cutting across a much wider distribution than either of these other measures. And what's so interesting, a 10-item CAT starts approximating what that full item bank is in terms of psychometric properties. So if you look at them all together, the CAT is outperforming any of the measures we've done in terms of reliability. PROMIS has really taken off. This is outdated and it's already been translated into 33 different languages have been requested. There's a whole international panel that are working to try to adapt and use it as well too. What I want to do is shift over and show the parallels with Neuro-QOL and some of our other measures as well. So Neuro-QOL, this is a good day, a good week in the life of Dave Sella. So 2004, end of the fiscal year, must have been September 29th. I think he got the PROMIS Award saying that he was going to run the Statistical Center and Technology Center of PROMIS, really the main grant to coordinate all the activities. A day later, he gets a $6 million contract from NINDS to develop something similar, except geared towards the neurologically impaired populations. And what was real interesting was he said, let there be parallels between the two studies. So I've taken Neuro-QOL and said, look, PROMIS is this generic health-related quality of life. And the problem that I've always seen working with people with spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, is that you really need some disease-specific aspects. You'll enhance measurement with doing that. And there's a lot of work. Lena Andresen came up with a quote with, giving people with spinal cord injury this SF36 mobility items. Some are irrelevant and perhaps offensive to people with disability. You're asking people if they've walked miles, if they've gone up and down flights of stairs, and they look at you like, well, if I could walk, I could, So this is it. So Neuro-QOL came in, and it was really the same type of goals as PROMIS, except it was designed for NINDS, that they wanted to use this as a common data element. So I've drawn this graphic because I think this describes it. The first thing the group did was decide which populations they had funding. So that's $6 million. What could it cover? Who should they focus on? And they had a list. They had a lot of experts and patients rating what was the most important. And they decided on these clinical conditions Next on the list, number 6 was people with spinal cord injury. Number 8 was people with traumatic brain injury. And you'll see me get into that in a little bit. But very similar, they decided that physical, mental, social health, a little bit of a different graphic, but a lot of overlap with PROMIS, of course. And the same thing they did, they took mobility, for instance, and they drew the ruler on how the items would rank with different types of scores. You know, the only thing you really have to get here is at the top end, you have running up and down an incline, taking a 20-minute brisk walk without stopping to rest. At the low end, you have moving from sitting on the side of the bed to lying down on your back, and are you able to get on and off the toilet? So again, that same thing. There's a ruler involved the same way. So Neuro-QOL is something that is now available for free, like PROMIS. Both of these are available on something called Assessment Center, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But as I started getting involved in spinal cord injury research, we started interviewing patients and really picked up on Elena Andresen's quote and made the argument that, look, with the investment being made by NA and DS, Neuro-QOL is going to be the expected outcome in neurological trials. And a lot of aspects of Neuro-QOL may not be relevant or specific enough. And what's important to people with spinal cord injury, what's important to people with traumatic brain injury. Those were the populations I was working in. It's the same logic could apply to lots of different populations here that people see all the time too. So what we did was we developed new scales that are spin-offs partnering. We partnered with Dave Sella and started working with him as well as researchers at RIC, as well as people within the traumatic brain injury model systems and spinal cord injury model systems. So here's the way I broke up the spinal cord graph, and this is even a little outdated because there's a few more awards, but you can see multiple awards started contributing to the development of the scale. So we have not only the model systems, but we have an R01 that I received, and then the VA, the Bronx VA, has gotten their own awards to develop things. So the first phase was a collaborative project with somebody named Ellen Jetty from Boston University. And we both proposed a similar project where Ellen was developing an activity limitation bank within the model system. And the model systems are this network of the best setters in spinal cord injury. They at least could get 30 people per year, put them in a national database, follow them up over years. So over 5 years, they'd recruit 150 patients at least. A lot of patients, some places could get 100 people per year. And then follow them up over years, and they design studies on spinal cord injury. So it's a grand competition. And 6 of the centers came in to work with us. And what we did was we started just going to patients, people with spinal cord injury, with a very broad question of how has spinal cord injury affected your day-to-day activities? What day-to-day activities are most important for you? And we went and conducted 18 focus groups across these 6 sites. We had a group of people with paraplegia, a group of people with tetraplegia, and then the group of people with clinicians, and from physiatrists, physical therapists, psychologists, occupational therapists, nurses. We tried to get a multidisciplinary approach. Pam Casella worked with me and really took the lead on trying to figure out how we would utilize the qualitative data, and we actually came up with a methodology we did, but we were really looking for the emerging things not covered in the existing measures. And we developed, this pool of 743 items. We ended up winnowing it down to 328 and really tested the cognitive interviews with everything. We also had Northwestern. We had some Spanish speakers review all our items just to see if they could be translated at a future date. We probably had the best review from an editing content because they got rid of anything that was colloquial in our discussion. This probably is a little hard to read, but just so you can get a sense graphically of what we did, we took the physical functioning bank, because that's what we were looking at. We took items existing from a measure called the impact that Alan Jetty had created earlier. We took Neuro-QOL items, we took PROMIS items, and we took pediatric items that the Shriners had developed, MJ Mulcahy, who's now at Jefferson. And we looked at what was important to people with spinal cord injury, and there really weren't items on grooming, toileting, sexual functioning, that, the transferring, just didn't cover it in the PROMIS because that was geared towards general population. So we really put it under the hood. The other thing we started realizing too is that people with spinal cord injury, you don't want a global measure. You want to break things into basic mobility, ambulation, wheelchair mobility, and really break it apart. Even using the items that were from the general population, but a trial or when you're trying to understand somebody, all of those things are relevant, and the ambulation items may only be relevant to a fifth of the population or so, because not everybody's walking. We also took fine motor and self-care and broke those abilities out. What we did was we were aiming to get 750 cases per site, and this is the power of the model systems. Within probably 9 months, we had one of the best, well-worked up samples, as heterogeneous as possible as we could get, really balancing our criteria. We had stratification criteria, and we overachieved. We got 854 samples. And that's just a model systems having that capacity to do it. And so we developed these large item banks, and similar to what you had seen before, where you have, are you able to touch, hug a partner? Are you able to stand supported in a standing frame? Are you able to move your upper body while lying down? And then it goes down to, are you able to stand without any support for 5 minutes? How much difficulty do you have standing up from, sitting position? So again, that same ruler type approach is what we developed with self-care as well too, from scratching your face and able to wipe below your nose to, are you able to cut your toenails? So, you're getting the idea that what is the power of these CAT testing is having a wider range of items across the spectrum. If we've written our items correctly, it will, and that's why we wanted the heterogeneous sample, but then you'll only give a snippet because it's computer adaptive testing to get at that. So the other things we did was we also had an RO1. So with the RO1, we looked at the other domains of functioning, from physical health, mental health, and social health. Again, similar type of thing. We took model system players. A few different ones came on than before, but we had some core people at Chicago and New Jersey and Michigan and the Craig Hospital who really helped. And when we did our testing, we went back to the same population. So a lot of people would come in and take these different packets. But just so you can get a sense of the things we developed that really were unique to people with spinal cord injury. And this is what people told us: the bladder management difficulties, bladder complications, bowel management difficulties, skin pressure ulcers, and then pain interference, which really are PROMIS items. So we didn't do very much in developing. We just took the existing PROMIS items for the pain interference, but we recalibrated them to see how they would work. Instead of a general population score and administering, we selected items based on our SCI sample. And just so you can see, the types of things we developed, this is coming from what patients told us. I worried we'd have a bladder accident. Bladder accidents limited my independence. I was bothered by urine leakage, etc. UTI limited my daily activities, so questions on UTIs. Bowel movements, especially bowel accidents, limiting independence, and just the whole social, if people have bowel accidents, it's really, really tough. And a lot of people have to contend with pressure ulcers. If people with a pressure ulcer, they could go on bed rest for months, have to be off of it. So this really can interfere with everything we're able to do. These are the concerns that patients told us, and we tried to develop it this way. Just to give you an idea of the importance of patient feedback, we went in expecting depression and anxiety, the typical mood disorders in spinal cord injury. And yeah, people said that's important, but I think it was universal that everybody missed activities they were doing, thinking about things they used to enjoy. A grieving process that really was marked. The other thing people said is, I was struggling with coping with my disability until I opened a new book and realized that I got a life to live. I'm just different. It's different, and I'm moving on. And that opening a new book, that resilience quality to things, So we developed banks on that. And then just people feeling high self-esteem, feeling attractive, feeling like they're, adequate or inferior questions, as well as trauma. These are all things that aren't on the general PROMIS that they would have missed, but are so important clinically to this population. We brought out independence and autonomy, and Neuro-QOL had gotten at stigma, but we tailored it for people with spinal cord injury. But you can just see here, when there was a PROMIS bank like depression and anxiety, we took those items, we just made sure the items worked and it optimized them for spinal cord injury. For Neuro-QOL, they had a positive affect well-being stigma. We took the participation measures from there, but then everything else would be spinal cord injury related. And again, this logic has been used in a lot of different grants in our projects. Traumatic brain injury, we applied the same type of logic and same thing we were doing. And then Noelle Carlozzi moved in and started doing Huntington's disease. Outdated slide, she had an RO3 at first. We had one together, and then she recompeted for an RO1 and was funded to really develop it in Huntington's. How am I doing on time? So about 20 minutes left. So what I just want to jump to is talking about where you can get these. So all of these computer adaptive tests in short forms from the PROMIS, the Neuro-QOL, and our traumatic brain injury quality of life and our spinal cord injury quality of life, everything's on this assessment center website. So you can download scales. If you go to www.assessmentcenter.net, it'll be there. I think it's on the next one. And it's actually a data management software. Here's the first look at the website. And once you sign up and you register for the site, it's free to do that. It's what they ask you to do is just respect copyright. But you can find the instrument library and you can get the manuals, etc. We feel we've done things a little bit better because we've tailored our test to people with TBI or SCI and removed items that were misfitting. We then used an item response theory approach to move scores over back to the same metric, so we could preserve that metric for comparison. But what potential does this have to clinical functioning, clinical care? Because this is the big question. So, there we go. So, some of the big questions, and the race is on right now, and an agency like PCORI, NIH to some extent, but really PCORI, is really trying to say, how can we get these patient-relevant tools that have really been ensured that there's relevance to patient groups? How could they get used in clinical care to get the communication so that treatment is centered on the patient, not from the provider side? And that's the big question right now. So there's all kinds of research going on now to try to develop new reports for clinicians, also reports for patients. Can we have self-management programs so patients get their own report and can monitor their scores? Big push to integrate these pros into medical records. Epic has advanced this and incorporated some PROMIS measures in. So the current Epic release, it's in a module right now, but there's some structured, short form scales that they pulled in. They are working right now to get some computer adaptive testing. But there are programs at New York University, where I was before this, in the orthopedic center, they were giving iPads in the waiting rooms. People would take it, and the idea was that score would be attached to the chart or on the physician's screen right before the clinical encounter would occur. And could that facilitate discussion and any flags if somebody's coming for visits routinely, compare their performance at one time to other times? A lot of potential. Rehab Institute of Chicago right now has a major initiative to look at how patient-reported outcomes could gear the evaluation of the rehab services that RIC is providing. So lots of questions on population health type questions that are coming. This is geared, it's developed on the iPad now. You could have people do it. There's a study that was just published out of the Northwestern group where they actually had the coordinating appointment team send patients links saying, you're coming in tomorrow, please do this online tonight. And then it would be a flag, so when they checked in for their appointment, the receptionist would see if they've done the score or not, if they've actually taken it. And if they haven't, they'd say, oh, here's an iPad for you, why don't you sit and do this before treatment. Cincinnati Children's Hospital has made this a strategic plan for all their care. Cleveland Clinic, the neurology clinic, is doing it, but Cincinnati Children's Hospital, I think, is doing it in a bigger way, where all of their centers are doing it, and they coordinated things from the top down, so that if the person is in the waiting room taking it and they haven't completed this, then the intake team would work, even if they got to the treatment room before the provider comes in, they would work with the person on completing it and give whatever assistance they need. So that's what we're finding. And this is again a very outdated form, but there's large academic centers that are starting to move and integrate PROMIS into their electronic health record. Vendors are requesting it, and then that 2012 Epic does it, and I think it's the 2016 release where the cats will be in there in the future. When PCORI had PCORI did something really interesting. On their own dime, they flew 120 researchers who are in this area out to Atlanta for a brainstorming meeting to help them write what could be a priority statement on doing this. So it's unclear where they're going with it, but they were getting a lot of information. And Albert Wu from Hopkins prepared this incredible report, and I could send anybody a copy of it. It's publicly available, but he had case examples in each one of these systems, from Epic, Cleveland Clinic, Dartmouth Spine, the group Health Cooperative. Each one of these groups had a case example in their study, and the person who was chairing it really gave a talk at the meeting. So, the big question right now, and I think where the need is we can get these scores. We're starting to see technology-wise of how to do it, but how do we work to get that communication between providers and patients? How do we make it meaningful? How do we make the scores actionable so they really could be used in addressing clinical care issues? With that, why don't I stop? Because I do want to have time for dialogue and questions and stuff too.
So, that was fantastic. I learned more about. I've been thinking of trying to use PROMIS in a grant, as you're probably aware, for some time. I learned more about it today than I ever did before. So it's fantastic. So in developing suites of questions, how do you take into account sociological determinants of healthcare disparities and cultural competency?
Let's hope I understand the question. I think it was how, when we're writing items and developing this, how do we make sure it would fit across cultural groups and really sociodemic, demographic characteristics. One of the key ways of doing it is to have lots of reviews from patients, lots of reviews from diversity in your sample, which is the first step. The translatability review was probably the best thing we ever did, because there were a lot of items that we just thought were really nice items, and people would come back and say that word means 5 different things depending on where you're from, and different Spanish-speaking countries, so we would get called out when we wouldn't see things, so that helped. The other way is, once you start getting your data back, you run something called differential item functioning. And differential item functioning really assumes that if 2 people have the same ability, the performance of the item should be identical. And if you see one group performing one way, another group performing another way, that would suggest there's bias in a subgroup. So if you're comparing African Americans to whites, and you're seeing different patterns and scores, assuming that they're the same ability, then you would flag that item, and that item would become inadmissible, and you'd have to take it out. And we've seen a lot of that not just on sociocultural, but also disease. So one of our findings in our PROMIS grant were looking at children with cerebral palsy. And the first item on the test, first item in the CAT was, I play sports as well as other children my age. And it worked, and it discriminated the best psychometrically in the general population, this large general population of children. And when you got to the children with cerebral palsy, we saw it because the computer adaptive test, the reliability and the correlations were looking a lot worse than the short form. We were like, oh my God, something's broken, and running around trying to figure it out. And then when we started looking at the item, that was it. That item had differential item functioning, where you had people who had high level of mobility impairment answering the item one way. And then you had people who were fine, who really could do a lot of things answering the same way. And it just was a logical pattern. I mean, the only thing I could think of is that a lot of children play wheelchair sports. So they'll say yes to the item. Some people might not care about sports because just isn't in their range of doing, but it was a biased item. So that was an example of a biased item slipping through. That can slip through for cultural groups too. And the best way to do it is to have large samples, a lot of people reviewing items when you're writing them, and then in the psychometric analysis, running that differential item functioning and testing it. PROMIS folks never tested against children with disabilities, so they didn't catch it. So you'll only develop it as good as the items you write, the samples you have, and the tests you do. And that's why this can always improve and get better. And it's a pretty easy fix. I mean, it may take a little bit of psychometric time, but if the data is all collected, you pull that item out, or you pull that item out for a group, or there's lots of ways to fix it. It doesn't mean PROMIS would be broken, but of course, those are the areas where we could improve. So, what other questions?
What is the clinical significance between two group of answers? And I'm asking the question because we used, in fact, PROMIS in one of our grants. And I had a hard time, we wanted to calculate the power. And with the power that was necessary for the sample size. And I couldn't find any on the website and everything. I couldn't find any papers. I used the PROMIS general questionnaire.
So I'm going to answer two ways. How do you know a difference in score is a real difference, clinically significant? Is it responsive to change? But then there's also the other side of it. How do you know if it's clinically meaningful too? Because if you start losing your clinical. So you're getting exactly where PROMIS is right now. There are just starting to be the studies coming up looking at data where PROMIS has been integrated into clinical trials, where they can look at differences and start testing the responsiveness, comparing it against other legacy measures. Those data are just emerging right now. There was a big priority that came out about a year and a half ago, where they funded about, I want to say, 5 to 10 grants to put PROMIS into existing clinical trials to start testing the responsiveness. So, people are using rules of thumb now. So, a half to standard deviation unit seems like a lot, but those data are just emerging. That's where PROMIS is. If you were designing something and it was high stakes, I would probably suggest use the legacy measure and put PROMIS in, and hopefully we can phase the legacy measure out over time. That's what I'd advise practically, just because of that. With clinical significance, there's some fascinating things that are going on right now, and they're applying techniques from education field, where there's something called standard setting in education. And Pam Casella, who works with me now over at University of Delaware, just 2 days ago got a grant from the Rick Hansen Foundation to start looking at clinical markers for some of our spinal cord injury banks. And what they're doing is using this IRT to develop a ruler, and they're developing vignettes based on actual responses on how people do to try to develop different types of patient characteristics. They get about 12 to 20 of these vignettes made up. And, you know, it'll describe John, who has trouble going upstairs, has trouble walking, you know, just give a clinical picture of them. And then you get a group of patients together and you ask them to put a bookmark where they think, oh my God, that's definite severity. That's probable problems. That's moderate. That's no problem at all. And they're putting the bookmark in where they think, because of item response theory, we know how the rulers work. We know where the severity levels are. And so some of the techniques that are coming out now are to try to devise these markers according to what the different scores would be, so that you can then have a flag that is clinically meaningful to patients. And they literally, supposedly it's one of the most fascinating studies, the people who have done it so far, because you're locking this group of patients in the room and they're talking about real issues and real life problems they're experiencing. It seems very clinically meaningful. And, you know, everybody's going to disagree, and you keep them there to discuss things until they reach consensus. And what everybody's found is that everybody wants to do, when can I do this again? You know, I never did anything like that. Providers as well, too, are getting really excited about it. So those are some of the emerging, and again, it's emerging, but that's where the field is. That's the type of grants that people are looking for right now, is how do you utilize and how do you make a dent on the clinical functioning side. So I hope that answers your question. I know I didn't give you anything concrete because, you know.
So we cannot say, for example, the difference of 2 points between the 2 points within the scores would be clinically.
You know, what I do in a study is I calculate the effect size and see if there's change. But I'd also have the legacy measure as a backup right now in a grant, and just say you're giving both. And a lot will depend on review panels. Some might love it if you switch all the way to PROMIS. Some might love it if you're with the secure one that they know. So it's really a roll of the dice on what people would like now. But if you put them both in, you can at least talk to both sets of reviewers, the people who would say PROMIS isn't ready versus the people who say, well, PROMIS is coming and we should use it. A lot of the grants coming from NINDS are saying, we want to see you use these common data elements. So if you're not, explain why you're not. So the nice thing about PROMIS is they're short. So I don't know if there's questions from any of the remote, and I don't know how those.
Questions from Wilmington?
Okay.
That's terrific.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming out.
Announcements. Come back next week, first of all. Sam Getty will be talking on familial hypercholesterolemia. He's really an expert on the subject, and as you all know, a terrific colleague. So online viewers need to contact Sarah Fay for CME credit and to be added to our mailing list. Sarah Fay, as always, taking care of everybody in her inimitable way. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks, David, so much for being here.